W.E.B. Du Bois, himself a New Englander and with the first Ph.D. from Harvard earned by a black man, declared the movement to plant the New England College in the South to be the salvation of the South and the Negro. Perhaps even more remarkable than these dedicated efforts was the fact that such efforts began to produce educational results early on.
What we're talking about here is culture and how some people labeled as black were able to find success shortly after slavery and even during the time of slavery, right? But this success, it largely depended on opportunity and also having a culture that allowed them to take advantage of those opportunities as W.E.B. Du Bois was able to do. And so to find out about some of this success, let's continue reading in the book right here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell, and see if we can get some understanding.
In 1871, the Georgia legislature created a board of visitors to attend public examinations at Atlanta University.
This right here was to demonstrate the Negro's competence in certain areas. Now watch this.
The chairman of the first board of visitors was ex-slaveholder Joseph Brown, who reportedly said that he expected the examinations to confirm the Negro's inferiority.
The former slaveholder Joseph Brown thought that these exams were going to show the Negro was inferior and basically incapable of thinking on an intellectual level, right? And remember, he was a slave owner. So his expectations were based on dealing with slaves, right? Which for the most part were cut off completely from education, right? But here's what happened.
But the recitations of former slaves in Latin, Greek, and geometry forced from him the confession that we were impressed with the fallacy of the popular idea, that the members of the African race are not capable of a high grade of intellectual culture.
These were former slaves he was witnessing show competency in Latin, Greek, and geometry, which made him realize that these people were actually capable of a high form of intellectual culture, which was something apparently that he had never seen in his life.
And the Atlanta Constitution could hardly believe what we witnessed. To see colored boys and girls 14 to 18 years of age reading in Greek and Latin and demonstrating correctly problems in algebra and geometry appears almost wonderful.
This was most shocking to them, right? And still to this day is most shocking to others when they encounter people from this ancestry who have developed their intellectual ability, right? Because they're used to seeing these people only dancing, entertaining, and doing religion, right? So to them, it's a shocker, right? Similar to how it was back then.
However discordant the philosophy of the American Missionary Association may have been with multicultural views prevailing today, the crucial fact is that it worked, and so many of today's notions do not.
The American Missionary Association is the missionaries that we talked about in part 5, who came from New England and set up the schools in the South. And so they found some level of success with certain kids by holding them to high standards and expecting nothing less from them, right? But today, what happens is people, they make many excuses for low performing groups, right? Which only further hinders their progress, right? And so you have to have high expectations for these kids, right? And you have to hold them to it, right? We don't want to hear any crying and complaining, right? No one's going to get a handout, right? You have to compete on similar grounds just like everyone else has to, right? This is the expectation and the standards today.
The first black woman to receive a college degree in America received it in Oberlin's class of 1862. She became the principal of a remarkable high school for blacks in Washington, D.C., discussed in a later essay as Dunbar High School.
Dunbar was a highly competitive school which had developed a culture that set those young folks up for success, right? And this was true all the way until the culture of that school went downhill and fell into the pit, right? But for some time, many people came out of that high school prepared, and that's because they had prepared staff that helped develop the standards for those kids in that school.
Of that school's first 10 principals, 3 were graduates of Oberlin, 2 graduated from Harvard, and 1 each from Amherst and Dartmouth. In essence, most of this highly successful school's principals during its early formative period had New England educations in a New England culture, whether or not they received that education in New England itself.
Keep in mind that New England is in the North, and the North had a vastly different culture from the culture of the South, right? And better education was one of those differences, and a huge difference at that, right? And so these principals at Dunbar High School in DC, they were trained in New England's approach towards education, right? And so they were able to bring that training with them and implant it into Dunbar High School and also other schools and other colleges, right? And as a result, this is what happened.
A wholly disproportionate share of future black leaders came out of the schools and colleges established by New Englanders in the South, not even counting Oberlin College or Dunbar High School.
They were able to produce way more black leaders out of these New England established schools than the schools that were not, right? And so here are some of the examples of the leaders that developed out of those New England established schools.
These alumni of institutions founded as New England enclaves in the South included W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin Luther King Jr.
You see that? Don't ever let anyone tell you that culture doesn't matter. It's the most important thing, right? And it makes a huge difference on the outcomes of people's lives. Understand.
In addition to these individuals from these Southern institutions, the first black man to graduate from Annapolis, the first black woman to earn a PhD, the first black general, the first black cabinet member, and the first black federal judge all came from the same public high school, Dunbar High School in Washington, with its culturally New England educated principals in its formative years.
When you see these types of trends, then this lets you know that this is not by some coincidence.
Such concentrations of black pioneers and leaders in a few highly atypical cultural enclaves suggest that their achievements were not solely a matter of individual ability, cream rising to the top, but were also a result of a culture very unlike that in which most blacks were raised and educated.
Their achievements of being the first black general, cabinet member, and federal judge were not just individual efforts, but it also came from having a culture that was very different from the prevalent black culture, right? Which was designed to keep people in the pit. Understand clearly.
However much the achievements of these individuals have been celebrated, the culture behind those achievements has not been.
To celebrate the culture behind those achievements means for many blacks to celebrate a culture that's opposite to their very own, right? And it makes many non-black people feel like they're picking on them or that they're being racist if they do so, right? And so many people, they just let blacks do their own thing and they don't really provide any feedback or any type of criticism to help them out, right? And this is for fear of having their character or their intentions attacked, right? So people, they just let black people do counterproductive things, right? Or they find ways to capitalize off of those counterproductive things and make money off of it. This is how it goes.
Today, the culture that is celebrated in much of the media and in the schools is not the culture that succeeded, but the culture that has failed, the black redneck culture.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, he calls it the black redneck culture, but at this point, it's simply just the black culture, right? Because black people, they're the ones who take ownership of it, and they're the ones who promote it, and they're also the ones who help spread it around the world, right? And I was guilty of this too at one point, right? I can't even lie about it, right? When I used to identify as a black person and indulge in the many celebrated parts of black culture, right? I was a wanderer on the path, right? A person down in the dungeon and a person in the pit, right? But as I lifted up my eyes, I was able to see a dim light. And with that very dim light, I was able to search until I found a ladder. And on that ladder, I climbed rung by rung completely out of the pit until I found myself in the free world. And then I found out that in the free world, life is much better and it makes more sense, right? And so I'm encouraging you to do the same thing, right? And so this is the end of part 6 commentary on the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.